Hello and welcome to this edition of Inside Stream. I'm your host, Dr. Manmohan Radhesham Yadav, and in today's video, we will be talking about the situation that is developing in the Europe. Let us start with the Ukrainian war. Ukrainian forces are under steady pressure from the Russian forces. Russian armies are advancing slowly but steadily on almost all the fronts along the entire front line, while at the same time the British government, the French and the German governments seem to back the Ukrainian current position of fighting the Russian forces till the very end. There have been changes, geopolitical changes, political changes, and the changes in the leadership of the American government. The new government is of the opinion that America should distance itself from the current war situation in the Ukraine. The current president has mentioned several times that Ukraine must pay for all the money that has been provided to it, lent to it by the previous American government. The claims of more than 500 billion US dollars being demanded by the US government from the Ukrainian government have been making news rounds all over the world. While at the same time, the US government has also proposed an agreement whereby the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian government must hand over its mineral resources, specifically talking about the rare earth mineral resources, in order to repay the US government for all the expenses and the economic damages that it has suffered while financing this Ukrainian war. The Ukrainian government is very hostile to this particular agreement and has refused to sign it, which has triggered a lot of people in the Washington, in the Oval Office, and rightly so, because the American government is of the opinion that the Ukraine has only been using its resources, its financial resources, to enrich a few elites sitting and ruling in the Ukrainian government offices. A large part of the Europe is of the opinion, specifically the European governments, the West European governments, are of the opinion that Ukraine should be supported, whereas the US government is against doing so. There have been few meetings and talks, specifically in Saudi Arabia, between the representatives of the US government and the Russian government, which has angered the European Union and the Ukrainian government. Although the topics that were discussed in this particular meeting were completely associated with the bilateral relations between the Americans and the Russians. European Union is of the opinion that there should be no talks between the US and Russian government unless and until Europe is given a seat at the meeting table. Ukrainian leadership has also been angered by this particular meeting, but at the same time, there is very little that they can do to prevent it, because evidently and more specifically talking, this entire meeting has been about the bilateral relationship, the financial relationship between the Americans and the Russians. And both the parties in a press conference have stated that the meeting was overall positive and they are looking forward to further meetings in order to strengthen the ties that were severed by the previous American government in order to promote mutual development, cooperation between both the nations. Coming to the situation in Europe, Europe has been suffering from economic depression. A large parts of Europe, European Union, are facing economic crunches, while at the same time there have been several claims over the past few months and perhaps even year or so that the European nations are being deindustrialized. All the industries are moving to America, they are moving to the Chinese or the India, while also at the same time this has resulted in mass unemployments. At the same time, there have been insistence by the European governments to continue to fund the European war, the Ukrainian war, which is being supported by the European Union. There are further opinions that if European Union fails to support the Ukrainian effort, the Ukrainian war effort, the Russian forces will roll over Ukraine and then they will be poised to invade the NATO nations in Eastern Europe. Of course, a large number of political pundits are of the opinion that this is a pure myth and this is being spread among the people in order to garner support from the general populace of the European nations in order to help the European governments support their Ukraine war effort. The European Union's nations, specifically the NATO members, it can be said that they are quite horrified about the fact that the Ukrainian war is somehow bringing the Americans and the Russians on a negotiating table and perhaps even strengthening their economic bond. The previous US government was openly hostile and quite aggressive in its approach to sanction the Russian industries and minerals outputs and various other petrochemical products that were being sold by the Russians, whereas the current government seems to be willing to work with the Russians in order to establish financial relationships, re-establish diplomatic relations in order to move forward. It can further be said that NATO members, specifically the European members of the NATO alliance, are scared of the fact that if there is a reconciliation between the relationship of United States and the Russians, Europe may be abandoned by the Americans, because American government is currently of the opinion that Asia Pacific should be their prime focus. And when we are talking about Asia Pacific, we are specifically referring to the growing influence of the Chinese nation. The current government has clearly stated and perhaps even emphasized the fact that the China is a greater threat to the American hegemony all over the world, while at the same time the current government seems to be willing to commit massive resources to Asia Pacific region and the Middle East, while at the same time Ukraine is being abandoned rapidly. The flow of weapons will be stopped sooner or later. At the same time, it is also said that Starlink services may be stopped from 1st of March to the Ukrainian army, which has played a key role for its communication and has allowed the Ukrainian nation to continue to face the Russian military might. It is further observed from what the recent developments have been that the European nations are in panic. Once the Americans leave Europe, the European nations will have to defend themselves on their own. European nations have enjoyed the protection of the US government because the US armies have been constantly present ever since the World War II was ended. And they have been protecting the European nations for a long time against the Soviet Union, while at the same time, after the collapse of the USSR, a large part of the of the European militaries have been steadily being disbanded. The current nation that claims to be the strongest in the European Union is definitely France, but at the same time, it is also suffering from massive military cuts. It has a standing army of just about 150,000. The second largest army is probably the British army, which is approximately around 75,000. The combined military strength of the European nations, of the NATO members of the Europe, it can be said that it is not sufficient to withstand the massive armies of the Russian nation. And once Americans abandon the Europe, it may be said that Europe will be on its own to fend for itself, and they will have to cut their other spendings, which is being used for healthcare, infrastructure development, education, and so on various other efforts. And it will have to be channeled into the defense industry to strengthen their own armies, which the European nations have had the luxury to ignore so far. And therefore, it can be said that Europe is in panic. There is economic depression, there is political anxiety, and the Ukrainian government is growing rebellious. At the same time, the Ukrainian president is asking for more and more funds, weapons, and ammunition for its armies, which simply doesn't exist in the arsenals of Europe. America is not willing to provide those weapons, but at the same time, the Russian military war output is growing steadily. The Russian forces are growing larger and stronger by the day. Hence, it has become very necessary for the European Union to take a side, and they have chosen to side with the Ukrainian, a ship that is sinking. And therefore, in order to convince the Americans to come back to the side of the Europe in supporting the Ukrainian war, French president visited Washington few days ago, and the results seem to be very much negative. The British Prime Minister will also be visiting Washington, meeting the US President, and the expectations are very much the same. The outcome is expected to be same as that of the meeting that went between the French and the American president. Russia is hopeful about re-establishing its previous economic ties and perhaps even strengthen it with the Americans. The BRICS bloc has been growing stronger. BRICS nations, although they have never claimed that they are willing to issue a common BRICS currency, but the very union of BRICS nations, BRICS plus nations, has brought the US dollar under significant pressure. And the previous sanctions that were imposed by the previous US government have acted as an incentive to move away from the US dollar, which has resulted in decline in the global demand for the US dollar, and its status as a reserve currency has been called into question. The current US government wants to restore the dominance of the US dollar while at the same time strengthening ties with almost each and every member of the BRICS nation, and therefore the government from the very first day has been making efforts to maintain strong contacts with almost every major regional power all over the world. The European Union is perhaps being left out. It is feeling isolated, and Europe is fearful of the fact that once major powers emerge all over the world and there is a multipolar world, European nations without the US will not be in a position to call themselves a mighty power, a superpower, a power which has been borrowed by the US armies, which has been lent by the Europe, which has enabled the European nations, specifically the British, the French and the Germans, to pose as superpowers all over the world and to do their bidding and act independently on their own initiative to pursue their own goals. So the situation continues to change, the situation continues to develop, and it will be interesting to observe in the coming days that how the world opinion is shifting towards a much more multipolar world other than a hegemon which controls almost all the geopolitical decisions in the world. This was my opinion about the current situation. I will be returning with another video soon. Thank you.